So, imagine standing at the base of a massive mountain, and this mountain is literally on fire.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. The ground beneath your feet is violently shaking. I mean, there are continuous earthquakes happening, the air is thick with smoke, and blinding lightning is flashing across the sky.
That sounds absolutely terrifying.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then, an audible, booming voice calls out from the heavens, and it threatens to strike you dead if you take a single step too close.
Yeah. That was the Old Testament reality of meeting God at Mount Sinai.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
But what if the highest goal of human existence is to stare directly into that same terrifying fire, and instead of being consumed by fear, you find it beautiful?
That is a staggering thought.
It really is. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm your host, and today we are embarking on a deep dive into an astonishing piece of historical Protestant theology.
I am really looking forward to this one.
Me too. So, our mission today is a comprehensive examination of Jonathan Edwards' sermon from 1753. It is called The Pure in Heart Blessed, and it is based on the text of Matthew chapter 5, verse 8.
Right, which says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God."
Spot on. We're going to unpack the historical context, the theological weight, and the intensely practical application of this single verse. If you, the listener, want a shortcut to being well-informed on how the Puritans viewed the human soul, the nature of God, and the pursuit of happiness, well, you are in the right place.
I think the contrast you just painted between terror and beauty really sets the theological framework for the whole sermon.
Oh, absolutely. How does Edwards open up his argument?
Well, he opens by drawing a stark, unmissable line between two very specific mountains. You have Mount Sinai in the Old Testament, and then you have the Mount of Beatitudes in the New Testament.
Right.
At Sinai, the Israelites were so overwhelmed by the raw, unfiltered presence of divine majesty that they panicked. I mean, they literally begged Moses to step in and act as a buffer.
Yeah, they thought they would die if they had to endure that terrifying display of absolute holiness for another second.
Precisely. They could not handle it.
I always try to put myself in the sandals of the average Israelite at the base of that mountain. You are fresh out of slavery in Egypt, you are in a harsh wilderness, and suddenly the God who split the sea is manifesting himself through devouring fire and deafening thunder.
The sheer sensory overload would be paralyzing.
Yeah, paralyzing is a great word for it.
And that paralysis was intentional. The delivery of the moral law was designed to instill absolute trembling awe. It was meant to show the insurmountable gap between a holy God and sinful humanity.
That makes a lot of sense.
But then Edwards asks his congregation to fast forward to the New Testament. On the Mount of Beatitudes, we have the same God speaking. The moral character of the Almighty has not shifted 1 inch.
Right. God is immutable.
Yes. Yet the delivery method is entirely different.
Because Jesus is incarnate. I mean, he is sitting on a grassy hillside speaking as one of us.
That is right. His face is seen freely by the crowds. There is no blinding glory forcing the audience to cover their eyes or fall on their faces.
Wow.
His voice is a human voice, utilizing human vocal cords. He speaks without the earth-shattering terrors that sent the Israelites running for their lives.
So how does our theological tradition process that massive shift in presentation? I mean, is it just a change in location or something much bigger happening here?
It is a defining shift in redemptive history. In our theological tradition, adhering to the Westminster Confession, we recognize the clear distinction between the administration of law and the administration of the gospel.
Okay, yes.
Edwards points to the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 17. That verse states that the law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ.
The moral law given at Sinai remains binding on all people.
Absolutely.
But-
But the manner in which God approaches his people has shifted from terrifying majesty to accessible grace. Jesus Christ is the mediator of the new covenant.
Which is such a comforting truth.
It is. By taking on human flesh, he bridges the infinite gap. He offers a clear, perfect discovery of divine mercy.
That sets the stage beautifully. But it makes me wonder about the specific audience Jesus was talking to on that hillside. I mean, why did he need to preach these specific beatitudes to the Jews of his day?
That is a great question. Edwards argues that Christ was directly targeting the carnal prejudices of the prevailing cultural mindset.
Let us talk about what that mindset looked like in first century Judea.
Well, the cultural and religious climate was incredibly tense. It was also highly specific. The Jewish people were under Roman occupation, and their expectations for the Messiah were overwhelmingly political and material.
Right. They wanted a military conqueror.
Yes, someone who would crush Rome, establish a global earthly kingdom, and bring them temporal prosperity.
And against that backdrop, Jesus presents complete paradoxes. I mean, the culture was ambitious for human praise and highly conceited in their own national righteousness.
Yeah, and Jesus looks at them and says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit."
Talk about a massive culture clash. You have a society striving for dominance and religious prestige, and Jesus tells them the kingdom belongs to those who recognize their utter spiritual bankruptcy.
And he does not stop there. He says, "Blessed are they that mourn." This directly contradicted those who place their highest happiness in worldly, carnal things and temporal prosperity.
Wow, he is really turning their expectations upside down.
He is. He blesses the meek, which confronted the proud, revengeful spirit that characterized much of the zealot movement and the legalistic factions of the day.
And he talks about hungering and thirsting for righteousness, right?
Yes, contrasting it with a culture that labored for perishable meat. They desired a political messiah who would bring literal earthly riches.
That brings us to the specific issue related to our text today, and that is purity of heart. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart," he is dropping a bomb on the religious establishment.
Oh, absolutely.
The religious leaders, particularly the Pharisees, were completely obsessed with external rites. They were fixated on the outside of the cup.
Yeah, they strictly washed their hands before eating. They took meticulous care not to become ceremonially unclean.
I mean, they tithed their garden herbs like mint, anise, and cumin down to the finest fraction. Yet Christ pointed out that inside, their hearts were full of extortion and excess.
They cared about a spotless exterior while harboring internal corruption.
Right.
The Pharisees assumed that because they performed the correct external rituals, they were automatically the favorites of heaven. They believed their meticulous outward compliance guaranteed their admission to see God.
But Christ shatters that assumption entirely.
He does. He accommodates his instruction to human nature, knowing that all mankind pursues happiness. But he redefines the prerequisites for that true happiness.
He relocates the requirement, basically.
That is a good way to put it. It is no longer found in ceremonial washing or dietary restrictions. It is located entirely in the heart.
Which begs the question, what does the reward actually look like? The text says, "The pure in heart shall see God." So let us decode this vision.
Okay, let us do it.
Since God is an invisible spirit, as stated in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17, how can a human being possibly see him? Is there a physical manifestation waiting for us?
Well, Edwards is remarkably systematic in how he approaches this. Before he tells us what the beatific vision is, he spends considerable time eliminating what it is not.
That is helpful. So what does he rule out first?
First and foremost, seeing God is not accomplished with bodily eyes. If the beatific vision relied on physical eyesight, it would make the superior part of man, which is the soul, dependent on the inferior part, the body.
I want to pause on that hierarchy for a moment. Modern people do not usually think in terms of the soul being superior to the body. I mean, we are so materialist in our thinking today.
We really are. But the Puritans, leaning on biblical anthropology, understood that the physical body is temporary. It is subject to decay, while the soul is eternal and capable of communion with the divine.
That is a massive difference in perspective.
Yes. To reduce spiritual blessedness to a physical phenomenon plays right back into the childish carnal notions of the Pharisees. They just wanted a splendid outward show.
Right. Because God is spirit, he does not have physical dimensions, colors, or shapes that a human retina can process.
Precise.
I think of it like trying to capture a Wi-Fi signal using an old school 35mm film camera.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You can point that camera at a router all day long. You can adjust the focus perfectly, set the aperture, and take 1,000 photos. But when you develop that film in a dark room, you will never see the internet.
No, you'll only see a plastic box with blinking lights.
Yeah. Why? Because you are using physical material equipment like lenses, light, and chemical film to try and capture something that operates on an entirely different non-material frequency.
That is right.
The Wi-Fi signal is real, it is present, and it carries massive amounts of information, but it is completely invisible to that specific type of physical instrument. The camera is simply the wrong tool for the job.
And in the same way, our physical eyes are designed to perceive photons bouncing off physical matter. Trying to see an infinite spirit with bodily eyes is a massive category error.
That makes perfect sense.
He continues his process of elimination. Second, seeing God is not simply hearing about him. Having someone tell you facts about the Creator is hearsay. It was secondhand information, not the vision itself.
Okay, so no physical sight and no secondhand hearsay. What is third?
Third, it is not speculative reasoning or rational deduction. You might use philosophy to determine that a first cause exists, or you might use logic to deduce that the creator must be all-powerful.
But intellectual deduction is a cold, distant exercise. It is not the beatific vision.
Right. And Edwards gives a chilling fourth exclusion. He notes that wicked spirits and demons have a very real, immediate apprehension of God's strength and displeasure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at the final judgment, the unregenerate will see God's justice displayed against them, but experiencing the terrifying realization of divine wrath is the farthest thing from the blessedness mentioned in Matthew chapter 5.
Okay, so if we rule out physical sight, hearsay, philosophical deduction, and the terrors of judgment, what is left?
Edwards asserts that human beings possess a faculty designed specifically to perceive spiritual reality. He calls this the eye of the soul.
We are so accustomed to trusting our physical senses, we assume seeing with our bodily eyes is the most real, most concrete form of perception.
But Edwards argues the exact opposite of that. He claims that the intellectual and spiritual perception of the soul is a vastly superior, more reliable faculty.
And how does he define this vision?
With incredible precision, he says that to see God is to have an immediate, sensible, and certain understanding of God's glorious excellency and love.
That is a beautiful definition.
It really is. It requires a direct sense of his pure holiness and his endearing grace. Notice the words he uses. He says, immediate and sensible.
This goes far beyond logical deduction, then.
Yes. It is an experiential, spiritual apprehension. You do not just reach a cold conclusion that God is holy. You have a direct, sensible discovery of the beauty and amiableness of that holiness.
You know, the word sensible in the 18th century carries a lot of weight. He does not mean sensible as in practical or level-headed.
No, not at all.
He means it is felt on the senses of the soul. It is something you taste and experience, like eating honey rather than just reading a chemical analysis of sugar.
That is a great distinction. Furthermore, there is a certain understanding of his love towards you specifically. Edwards says the believer views God's glory as having a property in it.
What does he mean by a property in it?
You see him manifesting himself from a place of love, and you receive the testimonies of that favor. This is what the scriptures mean when they talk about seeing the light of God's countenance. It is relational, not just observational.
But Edwards is careful to manage expectations, right? About what we can experience right now versus what is coming.
Yes, he draws a sharp line between our current earthly state and our future heavenly state.
What does he call our current experience?
He calls it earthly dawnings. He draws on 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. That is where Paul talks about seeing as in a glass.
Like a mirror.
Right. In the ancient world, a glass or a mirror was made of polished metal. It gave a reflection, but it was often dim or distorted.
So our current spiritual sight is a glimmering, an earnest, a dawning of the light.
Yes. It is real and it is beautiful, but it is mediated through the gospel, through the sacraments, and through the word.
It is the sunrise, not the midday heat.
Precisely. But in heaven, this knowledge transitions into what he calls heavenly sunshine. It becomes perfect, direct, and completely certain.
Oh, I love that imagery.
He compares this future heavenly vision to looking directly at the noonday sun. When you stand outside at noon on a cloudless day, there is no need for a complex logical argument to prove the sun is shining.
No, the evidence is immediate, overwhelming, and absolute.
Yes, the soul will perceive God with that level of undeniable clarity.
There is a striking observation Edwards makes in the text. It is about how we interact with each other right now, and it just blew my mind.
Oh, about seeing our friends.
Yes. He points out that when we look at our earthly friends, we do not actually see them. Think about that for a second.
It is a wild thought.
If I am sitting across the table from a close friend, I am not seeing their soul, which is the truest, most essential part of who they are. I am only seeing their tabernacle.
Right, you are looking at their physical body, the temporary dwelling place of their soul.
Exactly. I have to guess what they're thinking or feeling based on outward signs, like the words they choose to speak, their facial expressions, their body language. It is entirely indirect. We are constantly interpreting signals.
It is a massive limitation of human relationships. We're always one step removed from the actual person.
But in heaven, Edwards argues, saints will see the spiritual nature of God far more directly than we see a human friend sitting across a table.
That is just incredible to consider.
Because the eye of the soul will apprehend the Spirit of God directly. We will behold his attributes and his disposition toward us without needing outward physical signs, words, or gestures to guess his intentions.
That level of intimacy, that direct, unmediated perception, is staggering to think about. It makes our closest earthly relationships look like passing notes under a door.
It really does. Which naturally leads to the next major question. Why does this specific direct vision make the human soul truly happy? I mean, why does Jesus call the pure in heart blessed?
Edwards provides a robust psychological and theological framework for this, and it leans heavily into the Reformed appreciation for the intellect.
Let us unpack that framework. God gave man reason, and Edwards calls reason the candle of the Lord.
Yes, the Puritans viewed the human soul as an ordered hierarchy of distinct faculties. The understanding, or the intellect, was designed by God to be the leading faculty.
Okay, so the intellect is meant to lead.
Right, it was meant to govern the will, which in turn governs the affections and emotions. Therefore, the highest possible pleasure for a human being must be an intellectual one.
Specifically, the intellect beholding the supreme spiritual excellencies.
Yes.
So what happens when someone rebels against that design? What happens when a person pursues base, carnal pleasures instead? Chasing things that gratify the lower physical appetites at the expense of holiness.
Well, they have to actively stifle their own reason to do it. The conscience and the intellect know that gluttony, greed, or lust are destructive.
Right?
When a person indulges in those things, it causes a literal internal civil war within the soul. The lower passions fight against the higher faculties. You end up with a fractured human being, someone who is at odds with their own conscience.
But the joy of seeing God is entirely different. It is a delight that reason fully, completely approves of.
Absolutely. When the soul delights in God, there is no internal conflict. There is no guilty conscience fighting the enjoyment, whispering that you are doing something wrong or wasting your time.
This alignment of all the faculties leads to a sweet, massive tranquility.
It is the absolute perfection of the human creature. Pursuing carnal lusts debases humanity. It drags people down to the level of animals driven only by instinct.
Oh, yes.
But seeing God and delighting in His infinite glory elevates us to our highest possible dignity. It is the single purpose for which the human intellect was designed.
When the understanding finally reaches the fountain of God's supreme excellence, it has found the single object that makes it whole.
Yes.
I want to look closer at the contrast between the joy of seeing God and the pursuit of worldly happiness, because Edwards uses some very vivid imagery here.
He does.
We all know people who chase after wealth, status, or sensory pleasures. They are completely convinced that the next promotion or the next vacation is the ticket to a happy life. But Edwards calls these earthly pleasures bitter sweets.
I love that phrase because it rings so true to human experience.
It really does.
He notes that if you want to pluck earthly roses, you are going to find thorns. The beauty is always accompanied by pain. If you want to taste worldly honey, you will eventually find a sting.
Even something as noble and respected as increasing worldly knowledge brings pain. Solomon noted in Ecclesiastes that he who increases knowledge increases sorrow.
Right. The more you know about how the world works, the more you realize how broken it is. There's always a catch.
Even earthly friendships, which are wonderful gifts from God, bring a certain level of anxiety. I mean, friends have blemishes, relationships are subject to instability, misunderstandings, and eventually the unavoidable reality of death and separation.
Yes, earthly joys always have a shadow trailing right behind them.
But the vision of God brings no sting of conscience whatsoever. It brings no vexing care, no anxiety about losing it, and zero disappointment.
The light of God's glory is so strong and so pure that it fully possesses the human heart. It leaves absolutely no dark corner for sorrow, sighing, or pain to hide.
And it is not just a generic bright light, right? The specific attributes of God compound the joy.
Yes, the believer will see His justice, His infinite wisdom, His immutability, and His overflowing love. All these attributes stack together to create an unmixed, perfect joy. The mind is fully engaged in exploring the perfections of the Creator.
The concept of unmixed joy is vital, but we also have to deal with the scale of that joy. Edwards talks about the infinite supply required for an infinite capacity.
This is a crucial point.
There is a glaring mismatch between human desire and worldly supply. No matter how much affluence, strength, or pleasure a person accumulates in this life, there is always room for more desire.
You see billionaires who have everything money can buy, and they are still restless. They're still trying to acquire more. Worldly goods can never satisfy the human heart because they are finite.
So what is Edwards' solution to this?
This is where his theological brilliance really shines. He explains that the human intellect, by its very design, is a bottomless vessel. God created us with an infinite capacity for desire,
Why would God do that?
so that we could be filled by an infinite God. Only the Creator himself can fill the vessel he designed. The soul can dive into this bottomless ocean of divine glory and soar into this endless expanse of divine love forever without ever exhausting the fountain.
I am so glad you highlighted that unending progression of joy. Because God is infinite, the discovery of his beauty will never hit a wall. Millions of ages will pass in eternity, and the story will never grow dull. The saints will continually discover fresh, new facets of God's glory. That keeps their intellectual and spiritual faculties fully engaged and perpetually satisfied.
It completely wrecks the cultural caricature of heaven being a boring place where people sit on clouds playing harps for eternity.
Oh, absolutely.
Edwards is describing a dynamic, endless exploration of infinite beauty that keeps the intellect firing on all cylinders forever.
And this joy is secured by an everlasting foundation, right? Think about worldly foundations. They are sandy, they wash away with the tide of time. The economy crashes, empires fall.
Even our physical bodies betray us. Our senses wear out and our organs eventually turn to dust.
But God is the rock of ages. His glory is subject to no vicissitudes, no changes, no decay. The physical sun in our sky might fade or be temporarily covered by an eclipse, but God will be an everlasting light for his people.
The security of the object guarantees the security of the joy.
So, if this beatific vision is the absolute pinnacle of human happiness, the endless, unmixed joy that our souls were designed for, who gets to experience it?
Well, the text gives a very specific condition. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
Edwards argues that having a pure heart is the certain and only way to attain this blessedness. But to grasp what purity actually is, we first have to understand the reformed view of human nature.
Yes, we cannot appreciate the cure until we understand the disease. In alignment with Westminster theology, Edwards explains the inherent spiritual defilement of fallen humanity.
We are talking about the doctrine of total depravity here.
That is right. This does not mean humans are as evil as they could possibly be in their actions. But it means that every single part of our nature, our mind, our will, our affections, is stained and corrupted by sin.
Edwards uses a very stark, visceral analogy here to drive the point home. He compares unregenerate human nature to animals of an impure nature, like swine, dogs, or ravens.
It's a graphic image, for sure.
It is. If you look at a pig wallowing in the mud or a dog returning to its vomit, they do not find the filth disgusting. On the contrary, they love it. It is food that perfectly suits their natural animal appetites.
And in the same way, an impure human heart does not naturally hate sin. It loves it. It wallows in pride, selfishness, greed, and lust because those things suit its fallen nature.
The unregenerate soul feeds on spiritual defilement and actually finds it appetizing.
That is a harsh truth to swallow, especially for modern ears that are constantly told human beings are inherently good.
Right.
But without understanding our natural love for filth, we cannot comprehend the miracle of purity. Purity requires a fundamental change of nature, not just a change of habits.
Which raises a practical dilemma for you, the listener. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 9 asks a rhetorical question. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin?
The implied answer is no one.
Right. So what kind of purity is actually achievable in this life? Are we talking about sinless perfection?
No, the Reformed tradition firmly rejects sinless perfection in this life. Instead, Edwards outlines specific parameters for what he calls negative purity, which is the freedom from defilement.
Okay, where does negative purity start?
It starts with seeing the true odiousness of sin and actively abhorring it. Through the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit, the believer's core nature is changed. Sin actually becomes nauseous to them.
They no longer view it as a tasty morsel, but as poison.
Yes. So the appetite changes first. Second, negative purity involves possessing godly sorrow for past transgressions. The pure heart grieves that it ever fed on such defilement and rebelled against a holy God.
It is a sorrow that leads to repentance, not just regret over getting caught.
Exactly. Third, negative purity breaks the reigning dominion of sin. While sin still exists in the believer, it no longer sits on the throne of the heart dictating every action. Its absolute rule is broken.
And what is the final aspect of negative purity?
Finally, it involves continually striving for cleansing. The believer maintains a posture of constant warfare against remaining corruption, always seeking to wash away the daily defilement they encounter.
The analogies Edwards uses to illustrate this continual striving are incredibly helpful. He says the pure heart is like a vessel of fermenting liquor that works itself clear of sediment.
That is great visual.
Or think of a stream of good, fresh water flowing down a mountain. As that stream flows, it might get muddy at the banks, Dirt, leaves, and debris might fall into it.
But because the source of the water is pure, because the water is constantly moving, it refines and runs itself clear as it flows. It pushes the impurities out to the banks.
In contrast, a corrupt, stagnant pool of water will never do this. It just breeds more bacteria and filth. The believer's heart is like that flowing stream, constantly working to clear out the mud of daily sin.
Edwards also issues a very specific warning regarding negative purity that we cannot skip over. He explicitly warns against the lust of uncleanness.
What does that include?
This includes all fleshly impurities, whether they are acted out in practice or merely entertained in the imagination. He states emphatically that a pure heart takes heed not to prostitute the soul to such darkness.
That cuts right to the core. Mental purity matters just as much as physical purity. You cannot harbor a private theater of impurity in your mind, indulging in fantasies of lust or revenge, and claim to have a pure heart preparing to see a holy God.
No, you really cannot. Jesus said looking with lust is adultery in the heart. Edwards is echoing that exact standard.
The internal standard is exactly what the Pharisees failed to grasp. But purity is not only about what you eliminate, right? It is also about what you cultivate.
Yes, this brings us to positive purity. Edwards details the positive qualities of a clean heart. A pure heart actually delights in holy exercises.
It finds genuine joy in loving God, fearing God, and entertaining holy thoughts.
Yes, it is not a chore or a heavy burden for the pure heart to meditate on the scriptures or spend time in prayer. It is a sincere pleasure.
It possesses a new spiritual appetite. The old appetite loved the mud. The new appetite loves the refined light of the New Jerusalem. It actively chooses the things of God over the mean and base lusts of the world.
It hungers and thirsts for righteousness. This positive orientation toward God is the defining characteristic of the new nature given in regeneration.
And this brings us to a massive exclusive claim Edwards makes. He insists that this purity of heart is the only road to the beatific vision. It is the absolute prerequisite. Without it, seeing God is an impossibility.
That is a very strong claim.
I want to push back on that claim for a moment, just to explore the underlying logic. Why does Edwards insist this is the only way? Let us play devil's advocate here.
Okay, let us do it.
What if God decided to be universally tolerant? What if an impure person, someone who completely rejected God, loved their sin, and hated holiness, was somehow granted a VIP pass to heaven and allowed to see God? What would actually happen?
Edwards breaks down the logical impossibility of this scenario to 4 distinct points. First, he argues it would be fundamentally unsuitable.
Unsuitable to the majesty of God.
Yes. Think about a royal court. A king would never allow a sordid, filthy person, covered in mud and refuse from the streets, to waltz into his throne room and sit at his banquet table.
No, it would be an insult to the dignity of the crown.
How much more unsuitable would it be for the infinitely pure King of the universe to welcome a soul entirely defiled by the rebellion and filth of sin into his immediate, glorious presence? It violates the very nature of God's holy majesty.
The second reason is even more fundamental. It is naturally impossible.
Right. Sin, by its very nature, blinds the mind to spiritual beauty. Enmity against God and the sight of his beauty cannot exist in the same subject at the same time.
If a person's heart is filled with hatred for God's authority, that very hatred acts as a thick blindfold. They lack the spiritual receptor, the eye of the soul, to perceive his glory.
You cannot see the beauty of the lawgiver while you are actively trying to destroy his law.
Third, Edwards argues that even if we assume an unregenerate person could somehow be placed in God's presence and forced to look, they would be absolutely miserable.
They would find zero pleasure in the vision of God. Why? Because they hate holiness. They have no relish for pure intellectual and spiritual delights.
Heaven would be a torture chamber for the wicked soul. The searing light of God's absolute purity would be agony to a creature that only loves the darkness. They would want to flee from it.
That completely flips the common assumption that everyone wants to go to heaven.
Yeah.
Edwards is saying that unless your heart is changed to love what heaven is, which is the unshielded presence of a holy God, heaven would be a worse punishment than hell.
You would be trapped forever with the God you despise.
Finally, there could be no complacence, no mutual delight between God and the impure soul. God cannot take pleasure in wickedness.
Since seeing God's love and experiencing his favor is an essential part of the beatific vision, an enemy of God cannot experience it.
God would look upon them with just wrath, not with endearing grace. Therefore, without a pure heart, the beatific vision is factually, logically, and theologically impossible to attain. It is a closed door.
Which brings us to the application for you, the listener. We have covered the dense theology, the majestic nature of the vision, and the absolute necessity of a pure heart. Now we must synthesize this discussion and bring it directly to your own self-examination.
Edwards did not preach this to fill people's heads with historical trivia or abstract philosophy. He preached it to pierce their consciences.
Are you resting in external morality? Are you just keeping up appearances? Maybe you go to church, you speak politely, you avoid gross public sins, and you give to charity. But inside, has there been a genuine change of heart?
Are you scrubbing the outside of the cup while ignoring the sediment festering inside?
It is so incredibly easy to fall into the trap of the Pharisees. We assume that because we belong to a certain theological tradition or because we attend the right kind of worship service, we are automatically in line for the beatific vision.
We equate intellectual agreement with spiritual purity. But Edwards forces us to look inward, past our religious resumes.
Do you actually hate sin? Or do you just hate the embarrassing consequences of sin? Do you delight in holy exercises, or is your religious life just a heavy, burdensome duty you endure to keep up appearances and appease your conscience?
Those are the crucial questions for self-examination. And thankfully, Edwards does not leave his listeners hanging in despair. He outlines a clear, practical path for application.
What is step one?
Step one is to purify your hands. Amend your outward ways. Stop engaging in known willful sin. Break off your transgressions by practicing righteousness. You cannot pray for a pure heart while actively feeding your flesh.
And step two?
Do not rest in that external purity, but actively attend God's ordinances. Use the means of grace like the preaching of the word, the sacraments, prayer, to seek inward purity. Position yourself where the water of the word is flowing.
Step three requires brutal honesty. You have to search your heart to see your own pollution. You cannot be cleansed if you refuse to admit you are dirty.
Ask God to expose the hidden motives, the secret pride, and the quiet resentments lurking in your soul. Bring them into the light.
And step four is to beg God for the Holy Spirit. Edwards refers to the Spirit as the Spirit of burning. This references Isaiah chapter 4, verse 4.
Just as a silversmith uses literal fire to smelt metal, burning away the dross and leaving pure gold, the Holy Spirit acts like a fire in the human soul. He purges the filth and pollution of the mind. You must ask God to apply that fire to your heart.
And we must ground all of these steps firmly in our Reformed theology because there is a massive biblical tension here that we have to hold together.
Yes, there really is.
On the one hand, God commands us in Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 31, to make you a new heart and a new spirit. We are given a duty, a mandate to actively strive for purity, to amend our ways, and to seek God.
But simultaneously, we recognize the sovereign grace of God. As Romans chapter 9, verse 23 teaches, believers are vessels of mercy who have been elected and prepared for glory by God himself.
That tension is the heartbeat of Reformed sanctification. God commands the purity, and God graciously supplies the Spirit to produce the very purity he demands.
Augustine famously prayed, "Command what you will, and grant what you command." Our active striving, our fighting against sin, our attendance to the means of grace, all of it is fueled entirely by God's sovereign, supplying grace.
We work out our salvation with fear and trembling, precisely because it is God who works in us, both to will and to work for his good pleasure.
That is wonderfully stated.
Well, we have covered a vast amount of ground today. We moved from the thunders and terrifying fires of Mount Sinai to the endless, satisfying ocean of the beatific vision.
We have looked at the total depravity of the human heart and the miraculous fiery cleansing of the Holy Spirit.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over on your own. It is something that builds on everything we have discussed today. Edwards claims that a life of holiness is actually the pleasantest life a human being can live in this world.
Because it contains the actual seeds of the endless sight of God.
So, here is the question for you to consider. If your religious life feels burdensome, dry, or devoid of joy, could it be because you are settling for the external thorns of behavioral compliance rather than asking God for the new heart required to taste the endless, satisfying honey of his glory?